All right, so we left off with one last project that I wanted to talk about with the early European modernism, and it's an important one. It's the Weissenhof Siedlung, and I always tell my students when we're in class, and I'm going to expect you to know how to spell this from memory on a quiz, and then I like to see your shocked reactions. And since I can't see that, you'll just have to take my word for it that I will not make you know how to spell this, but you might have to pick it from a list. But Weissenhof Siedlung was a housing project design, not really competition, as sort of almost an exhibition. And it was put forth by the Deutscher Werkbund and was an effort to show how modernist architecture could be a solution to the housing shortages that plagued, well, many cities around the world, but especially German cities that were suffering both from an increase of urban populations from the as people came to the cities for work and during the Industrial Revolution era, but also the after effects of World War I. The economy was very poor in Germany, and people ironically tend to come to cities looking for job opportunities where often they don't exist and wind up in tenement slum housing. And this was part of the modernist movement's ideal that architecture could solve social and political type of issues, one of them being slums and housing issues. And so the Weissenhofsiedlung is an early attempt to show how that could be done. And it takes place in Stuttgart, Germany, which is just outside of Frankfurt, on a fairly major city in of itself, in 1927. And what's really fascinating about this exhibition is it is like taking the greatest names in early European modernism, and they all get a chance to showcase, some of their work all in one tight little area here. And so it's a real neat thing to study to really get an understanding of the full effect of European modernism, not just individual buildings all spread around the continent. And so Mies van der Rohe, who we talked about last time, was the principal planner for this. So he oversaw organizing the various different architects and then making the invitations and sort of laying out the site plan and assigning the architects different building types and so forth. And it was meant to be an exhibition of all variety of housing types, from larger scale apartment blocks to single family homes to duplexes and so forth, so that people could see how modernist architecture could adapt to any variety of residential needs. And the idea was that it would be open for several months or something in 1927, and people would come and they would visit it and they would get all excited, and they might take the ideas and maybe hire these types of architects for their own projects back home. But then Stuttgart would be essentially the project would be turned over to the city authorities, and they would be able to rent out the apartments and houses and so forth, and it would be literally a way to help solve some of their housing issues. And this is a historic photo that you're looking at, and you can see that it sits up near the top of a hill, kind of dramatically. There's a little road promenade that is along the side of the hill, so there's a nice vista to the left of the valley, and central sort of downtown Stuttgart is off in the distance to the left there. And here is a map of the exhibition showing the various architects that were involved. And so we're not going to talk about all of them, of course, but Mies van der Rohe, not only was he in charge of the overall plan, but he did a large apartment block right here. Over here is Peter Behrens, who we had talked about. He did a building in this area here. Max Taut, it's a pretty famous. Ludwig Hilbersheimer, he actually came with Mies to America and taught with him at IIT in the 1940s. Walter Gropius did 2 single-family homes, and Le Corbusier did one single-family home and a duplex complex that we'll be talking about. Bruno Taut, I mentioned him a couple of times. He also did a project. Some of these were sadly destroyed in World War II during the Allied bombing campaigns, and so those buildings that are striped in black and white did not survive, but the ones in black did, and I'll be highlighting the one in red is the Duplex by Corbusier. We'll be talking about that one. That survived as well. And quite a few of them have undergone significant restoration since World War II. So here's a few examples. This is Peter Behrens' contribution that did survive. And this is a nice comparison to the turbine factory that we saw by Behrens in the pre-World War I era, when he was still on the transitioning from a more of the arts and crafts mode of architecture into a more modernist international style architecture. This is fully embracing, at this point, Behrens is embracing modernism. And we see the white stucco and the punched window openings and the sort of geometric massing that is pretty characteristic of European modernism. This is one of the houses designed by Gropius. It's a historic view because this was destroyed. This has actually some almost precast components. It was meant to be built relatively inexpensively. That was part of the idea behind this, is that communities and city housing authorities could build these types of buildings relatively inexpensively and not be luxury villas and so forth, like we saw in, Via Savoy or the Tugendhat houses, which were designed for wealthy people. This is the apartment block by Mies van der Rohe. So this was more of a traditional multi-family commercial build or residential building, and we see again those basic tenets of modernism here with the white geometric massing, the almost ribbon windows that Corbusier had promoted. They're sort of divided. You can see the sort of central piers in between shorter segments of banded windows, but they create almost a sense of a large horizontal ribbon window that Corbu had been talking about. So you see a lot of, these architects are all sort of focused on similar ideas. And these pipe railings at the balconies are very characteristic of international style architecture as well. The project I want to really highlight or focus on is the Duplex complex by Corbusier, because this really reinforces all of those 5 points that Corbusier had promoted as sort of being the quintessential of international style architecture. So once again, as a reminder, we see point number 1 is the pilotis. The building or house itself is raised up off the ground. It's even more dramatic in this case because of the very steep hillside setting. There's a solid base, but then what we would call maybe the ground floor, first floor, is really just a core for the entrance and services, and the rest of it are these exposed pilotis. And the main living level is on the French premier etage, the main floor raised up, and we see the free-floating exterior wall with the long ribbon windows. This is a more true ribbon window than even what Mies was showing in his apartment block. And that you can pretty clearly see that the structural system represented by the pilotis, and you can even see them the columns sticking up a little bit at the top here, that is completely independent of the exterior facade, which can be completely free-floating and done in any way that the architect needs. And the ribbon windows are continuous all the way down, irrespective of whatever interior layouts might be occurring. And then on the interior, which we can't see yet, there would be free-floating partitions that are flexible and independent of any structural system of the house. And lastly, the 5th point would be the roof garden up here at the top, which we get a hint of from the exterior, and we'll see a detail of that in a moment. This next slide, I think I had mentioned before, I love looking at historic photos with these early modern buildings because they look very quaint. Like, ooh, look at the old car. Well, this was a modern, state-of-the-art automobile. Um, uh, you know, Fast cars and fast women or something like that. And the flapper style of dress and all of that. That was perfectly contemporary, even though we think of this as a little quaint now. But you can also see the Duplex by Corbu in the background there. So here's an entrance. These are my photos taken about 10 years ago when I visited the site, and it had already been pretty well restored here. So you climb up from the street level to this first level. You see the pilotis on the side, which are just fully exposed steel sections. They're, in this case, not concrete like he would often work in. These are steel, but the steel is not adorned. It's not wrapped or made pretty or anything like that. It's just honest, true expression of the structure itself, and that is one of the hallmarks of modern architecture. And then we see a short little stoop with a pipe railing, very simple, just curved pipe railing. And again, notice the color that Corbu introduces here. We're not just talking black and white, that is often interpreted for modernist architecture. Corbu especially was very much into bright and bold colors, as we've discussed. So here's the floor plan. We were standing at the very bottom. That last photo was taken about here, looking at the entry. So the ground floor area is really just a core for, the entry vestibule, maybe a closet. This is probably a utility room over here. And then you have a staircase that leads up to the premier etage, which is, as you can see, a very flexible, almost open floor plan. And this was actually taken to an extreme in this particular case with this duplex, which I'll explain in a moment. But you can see the dots. These are the columns that carry through, and that makes it pretty obvious then that the facade floats completely independent of that structural grid. So you take the stair up and you have this living area, and you can notice almost right away there's a couple of key, almost permanent partitions within, but the rest of the space is fairly open. And when we talked about Mies van der Rohe last time, we talked about his concept of universal design, which was the idea that a space had an independent structural system, and you could adapt the interior in any way for any building type that you wanted. And this, Corbu didn't call it that. He talked more about it as part of his 5 points and the idea of flexible interior partitions, but it's really on the concepts are the same, and we see that on display here with the idea that there's no defined living room and bedrooms and so forth. It can be reorganized almost in the Japanese style of living, in which the shoji screens can be slid open or closed and maneuvered around to whatever activity one needs during or throughout the day. On the very top is a plan of the roof garden, so the stair carries all the way up, and then you can come out here and have some outdoor fresh air and a nice vista actually of the valley beyond. So here is the Stair Hall, and again, I talked about Corbu being really well known for his sculptural forms, and we see that with the stair here, and the bold colors sort of emphasize those geometries and the sculptural forms. And this view, as I said, this has been restored back as it was during the housing exposition, and it's a museum, so you can tour through it. And this really represents both the columns, which are the structure independent of the wall, and you see how the ribbon windows just carry and slice through, without any regards to the interior room layout. But also this flexible plan. On the right is essentially a built-in cabinet, and you can see how the beds were designed to slide out from underneath. And so when you got up in the morning, you made your bed, you pushed it underneath, closed that cabinet, and now all of a sudden this could be a living room or a dining room or something like that. And then at night you would slide your bed out and it would be converted into a bedroom. but that it didn't have to be fully defined by, you know, four walls and a door and so forth like we think about today. This is another view of that. What's rather interesting, here's a historic view. What's rather interesting about this is that it didn't play very well at the time and doesn't really play very well in most people's lives today. Um, uh, when the exhibition closed, the Stuttgart housing authorities actually completely redid Corbu's house here. This is duplex building here, and put in more permanent walls and created bedrooms and living rooms and so forth, because no one wanted to live in this kind of style. It was just way too ahead of its time or innovative, and like I say, people even today don't really live that way, at least not in, you know, Western Europe and in the United States. So here's a view from the roof garden, and this is, you know, this is a really nice amenity, for, you know, middle class families, certainly for lower income, you know, working class families, to have a kind of outdoor space like this would be an incredible benefit, because if you're living in a dense urban environment, there aren't as many parks. It's hard to get fresh air and to have a little bit of a garden with flowers, or grow your own herbs and plants and so forth. So this is really a nice amenity that doesn't always work in reality, but it was part of this idealistic, um, uh, movement by these early modernists. And it had a very nice view in this case of, as I said, the downtown Stuttgart off in the distance in the valley. Okay, that finishes early European modernism.